Welcome listeners to Talking Eyes. I'm your host Leanne Trin, an optometrist and public health clinician based in Larrakia Country, also known as Darwin in the Northern Territory of Australia. This podcast was created to translate exciting innovative developments from vision research into a form that both clinicians and really any curious mind can understand. Innovation, simplicity, clarity. This series will be diving into a topic where the research has been absolutely awe-inspiring. The retina. It's just a small part of the human eye, roughly the size of a postage stamp, but it's an incredible piece of human biology that plays a central role in how we experience the world around us.
My name is Ju, and I am 35, and I have autosomal dominant retinitis pigmentosa. It runs in my family. My grandmother, my father, and his two sisters have it, and then two sisters are unaffected. I think he was affected in his late 60s, and I started noticing problems when I was in my early 20s. I was coming down the stairs, and I couldn't see the edge of the stairs. So I just mentioned it casually to my optometrist, and I think I didn't really, because I was quite young, so I didn't really understand what the condition was or what it meant. I just knew that I had this condition in my family. And at that stage, my father was still very mobile and he was still driving. So I didn't really think too much about it. She referred me to the eye and ear hospital. They did some testing, and then they sat me down and told me that I had the condition, and I had gone alone and not really understanding what was going on. So I think at that stage, because it was really only very mild symptoms, I couldn't see a little bit in the dark, and it was really mild, I think. So I sat down after they did all the testing, and they told me that I should evaluate my career prospects. But I think that's the only thing I sort of grasped from that whole initial consultation. And they said that there was nothing they could do. And actually, because I'm a doctor, they told me that at that stage I was in medical school, they told me that I shouldn't be a surgeon. But I don't think at any stage they said that I would eventually be blind.
Inherited retinal diseases. One time not long ago, there was very little we could do to change this prognosis. But critical advances in research over the last decade now provides hope to people with such conditions. Our guests on today's show include Ju, a person diagnosed with retinitis pigmentosa in her early 20s. As you've just heard, I am so humbled and grateful in this episode to be able to share with you parts of Ju's journey, as well as the journey of another person living with an inherited retinal disease. And this person would like to remain anonymous for now. Helping us also understand this field is someone you've heard from before, my friend and colleague, Associate Professor Lauren Ayton. Lauren, you've got a few official titles, don't you? You actually many. I had a quick squiz at your LinkedIn, and I was just like, what is this girl doing this year? The main things that I pulled from that was Principal Research Fellow and Head of the Vision Optimisation Unit at Melbourne University, among a few other executive roles.
So look, I'm very much my research, and I'm incredibly privileged to work with such an amazing research team. And what we're focused on is the inherited retinal diseases. So these are the diseases of the retina that are caused by genetic mutations. And as a whole, the umbrella term, they're the most common cause of blindness in working aged Australians. And so our research team are very much focused on really anything to do with these IRDs. So we have a study called Venture, which is our natural history study. So we're recruiting people that have IRDs and learning more about how it affects their vision and their day-to-day life. We then run a number of clinical trials. So we work with pharmaceutical companies to test drugs and devices and new gene therapy treatments, for example. And then the other component of our work is really trying to learn more about how people with IRDs feel about their conditions, about the diagnostic journey they've had, and also about these emerging treatments that are coming up. So I'm really lucky to be able to work very closely with people that have these conditions, and also the support groups that work closely with them. So groups like Retina Australia and Vision Australia, Blind Citizens Australia, these groups that are designed to support people living with these conditions, we work closely with them to identify new research pathways as well. So my day can be hugely variable, with any of those different stakeholders involved, and that's what keeps it so exciting.
Absolutely. And I know that you do a prolific amount of reading because, you need to be across everything, don't you?
Absolutely.
Thankfully, you love reading. So
Absolutely. Although I must say I love podcasts even more. So this is best of both worlds here.
Now, inherited retinal diseases, there is a very specific definition for it, isn't there?
That's right. So they're basically a group of conditions that are what we call monogenic. So it means that they're caused by a mutation or a fault in one gene alone. And so that's different to something like age-related macular degeneration, which you'll talk about at a later date. And AMD is much more complex. There's multiple genes that are involved in that disease progressing, whereas with an IRD, we can usually target and identify what the one gene that's at fault is.
That makes it sound so simple then, Lauren.
If only. So the problem is that one gene can be one of over 300 different genes that have so far been identified. And so while we talk about these IRDs as sort of a big umbrella term, but as you can imagine, if there's 300 different genes that are responsible for causing these conditions, the experience of a person with an IRD can be really variable depending on what that fault is.
And so essentially, could there be then 300 different types of diseases because we're talking about that many genes?
Even worse. So there's 300 plus genes, but some of those genes actually have different clinical presentations. So, you may have a particular gene, but it might present slightly differently. So there's a...
So what's an example of that?
So there are particular genes where in some people it causes a macular dystrophy. So it causes you to lose your central vision primarily, but generally the peripheral vision is relatively maintained. That same gene in another person might cause what's called a cone dystrophy, which is a more widespread representation of that gene fault. And so it can be really challenging, and we'll talk a bit later about genetic testing, but it's not as simple as once we know the gene, we know what that's going to look like for a particular person because it could present differently. And vice versa, there's different genes which actually then have a pretty similar progression rate and a similar experience for a person. So as you can imagine, there's a huge amount of work going into trying to map out all of these different subtypes of IRDs, but some of them are incredibly rare. So some of these diseases, we would have less than 10 people in Australia that have that condition. So trying to learn what the normal experience is for that particular gene is very challenging.
Yeah. And so what would be sort of the top presenting conditions that we would be seeing out there in Australia and even globally?
Yeah, so the most common has, again, another umbrella term, which is retinitis pigmentosa or RP. Interestingly, the name comes about because historically it was thought to be an inflammation. So that's why it's got the itis at the end. So retinitis being that they thought the retina was inflamed. And we now know that it's actually a genetic condition which causes a really slow progression and damage to the photoreceptor cells. And so in retinitis pigmentosa, the rod photoreceptors are damaged first. So it means that people initially have problems with their nighttime vision or their peripheral vision. And the typical symptoms that we see are people saying that they can no longer see stars at night and they become clumsy. They start tripping over things that they never used to. Then within that RP umbrella, there's, again, a number of different genes. So there can be different ways that it's inherited. So some forms of RP are what we call X-linked. So it means it's much more prevalent in males. There's a whole lot of different genes with different rates of progression as well. But RP is definitely the most common of the IRDs. With RP, we talk about a diagnostic triad. So there's 3 things we look for. The blood vessels on the top of the retina become very thin and very attenuated. The optic nerve itself looks very pale and white, but the key thing is these bone spicule pigmentations that you see out in the periphery. And they're called that because the pattern of that pigment looks similar to what happens in an embryo when the bones of our body are forming. It's a very kind of similar pattern. So yeah, again, nice kind of quirky reason for the name.
So that clinical manifestation, is that consistent across all different types of RP?
Unfortunately not. So, we always talk about this triad as being quite important, but some forms of RP you won't see that pigmentation quite as much. Sometimes the optic nerve doesn't look as pale. So some of these forms can be quite hard to diagnose. And then getting into the more rare IRDs, there's other particular genes that you can't really see. You don't get that pigmentation change, for example. And so sometimes it can be, an unexplained drop of vision might be the only sign that you've got something going on.
Yeah, right. And so how does one diagnose these if there is that variation and that typical triad, which we were taught to identify, is not present in some of these RP patients?
Yeah, so it is very much about listening to the person, I think. So, for someone who sees somebody initially with symptoms, of clumsiness, of poor nighttime vision, those sorts of signs should make you start to suspect that there's something happening with the rod photoreceptors, and that's when, further investigation's needed. And I think it is really about trying to identify early signs to make that diagnostic journey as short as possible for people. So people with IRDs will often go through long processes. They'll be picked up initially, usually by an optometrist that's checking them and realises that something's not quite right. They'll sometimes bounce around between different specialists until they find someone with an interest in these IRDs. And then they might go down the path of further, diagnostic testing to get an answer.
So apart from retinitis pigmentosa, what are the other IRDs that we should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, so some of the macular dystrophy, so these are the ones that affect the central part of the retina first and very much are linked in with dysfunction with the cone photoreceptors. So one of the more common of these is called Stargardt's disease. And Stargardt's is one of those retinal conditions which has a very characteristic appearance in some patients, and they talk about piscine flecks. So they look like fish. They're kind of fish-shaped flecks on the retina. But again, IRDs don't like to follow the rules. So you can also get forms of these Stargardt's and these macular dystrophies that don't have flecks. And so it can be quite challenging to differentiate, and especially for these macular dystrophies, ones that are central, sometimes they can look a little bit like macular degeneration, like AMD as well.
I was going to say, where are these flecks located? At what layer of the retina?
This is it. So they do present sort of at similar layers, and so it can be a big key is often the age difference. So IRDs are usually seen in younger patients. So if it's somebody under the age of 50, you're probably suspecting more an IRD rather than age-related macular degeneration. There's a few other little tricks. So fundus autofluorescence imaging, which is a way of looking basically at RPE health. That can actually give you an indication of whether it's an IRD or not based on the level of brightness of that. But, these are very specific little tweaks which you learn after a long time. So I think, for primary eye care practitioners, it is a major part is listening to the person in your chair about what their experiences are, looking for family history. So, because these are genetic, if they are autosomally dominantly inherited or X-linked inheritance, these are both patterns where other family members are likely to show those similar signs as well. So it's sort of putting together the symptoms, the backgrounds, and then any clinical signs you can pick up. And what all of these IRDs have in common is that we're looking for retinal deterioration and degeneration. So it's, damage to the photoreceptor layer over time.
There's a very specific battery of tests as an optometrist that you could potentially use to investigate. We're talking visual fields testing. That's a test where we measure somebody's peripheral vision and the sensitivity of their peripheral vision. That I imagine would be a very important test to be performing if you are hearing the person reporting symptoms of poor night vision.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so there's a few ways that you can do that as well. So generally, in optometry practices, we use static perimetry, which is the typical visual field machine where someone sits down, they press a button each time they see a light flash around a bowl in front of them. Sometimes in research and in specialist clinics for these IRDs, we'll actually use a test called kinetic perimetry. And in that case, what we actually do is we, as the examiner, move the light around and we get the person to say when they can see that light appear. And the reason that it's very useful is it allows us to go slower and it allows us to double check points and to really, do a very customized visual field, because people that have these IRDs can end up with little islands of vision in different areas. And so if we can help map those out, it actually helps them to learn how to use those most effectively. For example, if they know that there's some really good vision down the bottom left of their vision, they know that they can use that to be a little bit safer when they're moving around. So we use a technique called Goldman perimetry, and this was very much what was used before all of the computerized visual field tests came out. They're actually really hard to get now. They're no longer made, Goldman visual fields, and so I have become a collector of them. So anytime someone's getting rid of one,
you'll be very rich one day.
I collect them. So we have 2 Goldman visual fields in my garage, much to my husband's delight. But it's really interesting how some of the older techniques are coming back. And we spoke in the introductory episode about how exciting it is that we have these new technologies coming out and, how that's really advancing research. It's quite fascinating to me that sometimes we have to go back to the really basic, old school technologies to get the right answer.
That's so interesting. And so you've talked about RP being common, retinitis pigmentosa, Stargardt's disease. Yep. What would the third most common disease be for an IRD in our population?
So another really important IRD in this space is called choroideremia. And so if we go back to our basic eye anatomy, the choroid is the blood supply right at the back of the eye. And so as the name suggests, the initial problem in choroideremia is that posterior blood supply. It's a very interesting IRD because it is one that we can pretty accurately diagnose from the clinical features alone. It has a very characteristic appearance when you look at the retina. And it's quite interesting to researchers and to clinicians because there are treatments coming up in the near future. And that's the other reason why, Stargardt's and RP are very much ones that we talk about a lot, because there are these treatments coming up in the near future.
That's so exciting. What number of the population are we talking about being affected by these conditions?
It's another fantastic question because, again, unfortunately, we don't exactly know in Australia. So we tend to use numbers from the US and the UK. We think it's around about 1 in 3,000 people. So we think that's between 18 to 19,000 people in Australia have these conditions. It is a lot of people. And when you think about the fact that, a lot of people will be undiagnosed because it's earlier stage conditions and they haven't been picked up yet. And there probably is a significant proportion of people with IRDs that have been misdiagnosed and think that they have something like age-related macular degeneration instead. And historically, that really didn't matter too much because, they would still experience a slow change in vision and it was a similar kind of management. But now we have treatments which are specific for age-related macular degeneration or for IRDs. It's become really important that we differentiate between the two. So a lot of research going into that as well.
Lauren, I'm assuming that because it's an inherited retinal disease, that people are born with these conditions. What age are we diagnosing these diseases currently?
Yeah, so you're right. So because they're a genetic variant of that particular person, they have that from birth, but the actual time of onset can vary drastically. So sometimes newborns are affected and have very low vision or even blind from birth, all the way through to people that won't even realise they have an IRD until they're in their 60s or 70s. So again, the diversity of the genes and the variation in when someone might find out makes it really complex to manage a lot of these conditions.
And often people are already well aware that a vision impairment or blindness of some sort runs in the family. So taking a thorough history can really point a practitioner in the right direction when it comes to inherited retinal disease.
My older sister was originally diagnosed with other eye diseases, not RP. So she was losing her vision, but they couldn't quite figure out why. And I'm a lot younger than she is. So I wasn't up to date with her day to day, what was going on with her. And then one day she got a diagnosis of RP. And then she told my brother, who's the next closest in age. And then he told me, but we didn't realize it was a hereditary illness. We just knew Diane has yet another thing wrong with her eyes. And that stinks. As we find out more about it with Usher's, it can present multiple ways. It can also prevent as hearing loss. And that's when we began to tie it together because our father couldn't hear. My son, when he was little, he used to call Oompa's ears are broken. So my father didn't hear very well, and he had hearing aids. My own son was born with hearing loss, but not profound. He was still able to function in this world like everybody else. Then my sister had a son, and he was born profoundly deaf or profound hearing loss. So then I went to the eye doctor regularly because I've got glasses to get my glasses, checked. And they did the retinal scan. And I was told I absolutely positively did not have RP. Didn't have RP. A few years later, I get it checked again, no RP, but I'm noticing vision loss. And because I know what I'm looking for, I know that I'm following the progression of RP. I couldn't see anything at night. I mean, nothing. People don't understand what night blindness is unless they've had it. You are completely lost. Somebody could spin you around. You wouldn't know which way to go. There's nothing to guide by. And what made me go to our doctor just for this, was when we were at the bottom of our driveway. We'd come home from a night out. And I looked back up at our house and I said to my husband, isn't it crazy how the house just disappears? It's just not there. And he said, I see the house clearly. I do not know what's going on with you. And I thought he was just giving me a hard time, but he impressed upon me through that night, I'm not giving you a hard time. I really can see the house. You really can't see the house, and you should be able to see the house. Also, I began to bump into things and misjudge where the ends of tables were, especially. More than once, I'd go to put a glass down on a table that there was no table there. My brain had just filled in table where there was no table, and I would just drop cups onto the floor. I have a darling little poodle dog who is with me right now, and I kept kicking her because I couldn't see her, or I'd step on her. And all these I found out later were signs that I should have picked up. I went to my GP and I told her what was going on. And she knew before that about my brother and sister. She'd been my GP for a long time. And so she recommended me to an ophthalmologist up here on the Central Coast. They ran tests. Those tests did not come back like one would have hoped. And so then they sent me to the University of Sydney's Sight Institute, where they run so many tests on your eyes. Then you wait for those tests to come back. It was during COVID, and I found out just like this, talking to the doctor in the same room that I'm talking to you in. And it was shattering. I really didn't expect it to be me, even with all the symptoms. Probably because my retina doesn't have spiculas. Not everybody's has spiculas. I do not. And also, I've been told I didn't have it multiple times. I thought it was in the clear. It was really hard for me to wrap my head around.
Lauren, you've alluded to there being extensive research around these three most common conditions of inherited retinal diseases. So we've got RP, retinitis pigmentosa, Stargardt's disease, choroideremia. What are we looking at in terms of treatments now and into the future? Is it, are we getting excited because there is so much potential in this field at the moment?
It's a really interesting point. So, historically the management was very conservative. So we would tell people to, have a healthy diet, have a healthy lifestyle, and that unfortunately we couldn't do much more. That's changed drastically in the last few years. So in 2017, the first ever direct-to-patient gene therapy, and this is for any disease. So this is a gene therapy that's given directly to the patient to correct that gene mutation, was approved. And this is a drug called Luxturna, and this is for a type of inherited retinal disease that's caused by a gene called RP65. So the exciting thing with this is that it's a gene replacement therapy. So we've identified in this particular group of patients what the gene is that's faulty. And so this treatment actually can replace that gene and help the retina to return to a normal state. At the moment, that's the only approved treatment that we have, and that's only for about 2% of people that have RP. So it's pretty small numbers that can be helped, but it's very much opened the floodgates for more treatments coming up.
Yeah, it's really exciting actually. And it brings me to this idea. I don't know if you're aware, but biohacking is very, very popular and trendy at the moment. So really looking at what your own personal body needs, not what the rest of the population needs. And this is where these advances that we've had in genetic testing really define what biohacking is. It is literally looking at your personal DNA code and then hacking it.
Yep, absolutely. So I think it's definitely a space that we're going to move more and more into, I think, with inherited retinal diseases. And we talk a lot in our field about personalised medicine because it really is. You know, these treatments that we're developing are very much about targeting, the cause at the root, so the genetic mutation that's caused that condition. Another really interesting example is in most cases, there's limited strategies at the moment for treatment, and that will change. But at the moment, we're at a low level of interventions possible. But there are some forms of RP which are linked to syndromes, and one that really is important to know about is called Refsum disease. And so Refsum disease is a condition where your body actually builds up a abnormal amount of a component called phytanic acid, and it's just because your body lacks certain enzymes. And unfortunately, what that does is it causes retinitis pigmentosa, so it causes vision loss, but it also causes issues with your hearing, with your joints. There's other things like your fingers and toes can be abnormal lengths, all of these sort of syndromic components. And the reason it's important to identify that is that for those particular patients, we can help them by changing their diet. And
by diet alone.
Just by diet.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So for these people, we basically cut out things like red meat, and there's a whole list of other things they need to be aware of. But by limiting their intake of that phytanic acid, we can actually slow down some of the problems that they get from that syndrome.
So this is really where genetic testing becomes really important, doesn't it? Previously, you wouldn't bother with genetic testing.
No, that's exactly right. So, genetic testing has been very expensive, very complex, and for something like an IRD, where at the time we didn't have treatments, it wasn't really needed. And so some people would access it, more for curiosity or family planning purposes. But that's very much changed now because of the fact that there are these gene-specific treatments coming up down the pipeline. And so all of a sudden, the importance of genetic testing in this space has changed.
I have the option for genetic testing. I'm going to take them up on that. I really was on track to do it about a year ago, and I was not psychologically ready yet. I thought I was, but there is no upside for me getting these tests done. When I talked to the geneticist, she said that there was more chance than not that they would never know what genes were involved, even if I went through the testing. My family already knows that it's a genetic problem, even if they can't find it. The only upsides I can see are that my children, should they want to have children of their own, if they were able to find the genes, they might be able to use different types of ways to having children that would not involve their children going blind. That would be an upside. And if there was a trial for whatever type of RP I have, that would be an upside, but that's a long shot.
So what does genetic testing look like for us today? Because you mentioned it's previously been really expensive. Has the cost come down, and is it more accessible now?
Yeah, absolutely. So, when you think about it, I still remember the day that they cracked the genetic code. It was one of my
highlights of your life,
highlights.
Lauren.
Oh, absolutely. It's funny. I have such a strong memory. So it was my year 11 biology class.
Oh my goodness.
And I remember my teacher, Les Glasgow, if you're listening. But I remember Mr. Glasgow walking in and saying, look, we had a whole day of science planned. We're not going to talk about any of this. We're going to talk about genetics, because this is going to change the world. And it has, But when you think about that, I'm not that old yet. Year 11 wasn't that long ago. In that amount of time, we've gone from knowing, just knowing what the genetic code is to now being able to test it. And we can test it at all different levels. So when we're talking about IRDs, if we think we know what the gene is, and in some cases we have a pretty good guess. So choroideremia, I mentioned before, looks very characteristic. So if we think it's choroideremia, we can just do a single test at a particular genetic location and see if it's right. And so that only costs about $50.
And that's really targeted because we have a prior inkling that this is what we're looking for.
Exactly. And then the next step up, we move to panels. And so panels are basically looking at those 300 plus known genes that cause IRDs. And so we look at all of those different regions of the genome and we're looking to see if there's any variance in those known genes. So that will give us an answer for about 6 out of 10 people. They'll get an answer from a panel. If not, then if we need to, we then look at going to more extensive testing, and that can be up to the level of a whole genome test, and that's where we actually get the genetic information for every part of the DNA. And then we're looking for, any sort of variation along that path. And as you can imagine, that's very expensive. We're talking thousands of dollars and very time intensive as well.
And where would we go?
Yeah, so there's been specialised clinics set up in most Australian states now to really target this. Historically, clinical geneticists were the first port of call, and that's still an option. So you can refer patients to either a hospital geneticist or to a private one. But the really exciting thing with some of the specialised clinics that are forming around the country is that they have ophthalmology, optometry, orthoptics, and clinical geneticists all involved in the one clinic, which means that people get a one-stop shop. So they can then, get some counselling on what they might have clinically, do the genetic testing, and then get some results as well.
So these are specifically for ocular diseases.
Exactly.
Because really when we're talking about genes, we're talking about the entire human body, and that's like you could unleash Pandora's box right there.
Absolutely. And I can't remember the exact way it works, but often when we talk about the genome, it's sort of this concept of if you had a really large book, so a book the size, for example, of War and Peace, and you cut up War and Peace into every single letter and then mix them up. This is the amount of data that we get from the human genome. And so trying to make sense of that can be really complex. And so, we do keep that really intensive genetic testing for people that need it. So we very much would prefer to go with a more straightforward test if we can. And a really important component with this as well is the counselling. There's a lot of, issues involved in choosing to get a genetic test. And so it's really important that support is available too.
That people understand before they go in for the test and then have the support afterwards.
Absolutely.
So if I'm going to go in for genetic testing, what am I going to expect? I'll walk in through the clinic doors.
Yep.
And do I need a referral?
Yeah, so you do need a referral. And what you would find, so depending again, all clinics work slightly differently, and we can provide details of these clinics in the show notes as well. What the difference is, is with these specialised clinics is that everyone there is aware of IRD. So, it's a quite high level of information around. So, you would get counselling on what they think the IRD might be. There'll be a lot of questioning around your family. So finding out whether anyone else in the family has this particular condition. And a really important consideration is for people that are thinking of having children, thinking about what that means and what the risks are of passing on that gene to their child as well. So there'll be discussions around all of those components. And then less personal things, but things like insurance implications. So what does it mean if you have a genetic test and then you're applying for life insurance, for example? So genetic counsellors and geneticists can give you all of that information. The test itself is very straightforward. So it's either a blood test or giving a saliva sample. Sometimes we take cells from inside the cheek. So we just use a cotton bud to scrape some cells and send them off to the lab. Results that the cells get sent off to the lab for testing, and they usually come back, within a few months.
Yep. And so you're not having ocular tissue removed for any reason, are you?
No, that's right. And so that's actually a very interesting, it's a very interesting question, because so when we talk about genetics, we talk about, it's either there or it's not, and It's not that simple. So for example, in females that have an X-linked IRD, they have one copy of the gene mutation and then they have one healthy copy of that particular gene. And what happens in female cells is one of those is turned on and one of them is turned off. And so we're very interested with others around the world to work out the ratio of that. Like, how do you know in any particular cell or tissue how many healthy genes you have and how many of the mutated versions you have? And so this is a really interesting...
And it varies by cells.
And so this is it. So we've been looking into tissues because it's interesting that there does seem to be a bit of difference in, the eye tissue versus the blood or the saliva. So there's some work going on into that very question. So...
Right, because actually I asked that question thinking that really your DNA should be in every single cell and it should pretty much be the same, shouldn't it?
Yeah, so generally speaking, when it's a gene which is not on one of the sex chromosomes, so the X-linked IRDs are a little bit unique, but it's an interesting space. I mean, genetics is very complex. You then have all of these other components. So listeners may have heard of epigenetics before. So environmental influences on our body can actually affect how much a gene mutation is expressed as well. So all of these things kind of tie in and lead to the fact that you can have two people that have the exact same difference in their gene and they will present differently, just for a number of reasons, including these epigenetics.
Yeah, and environmental exposure, different experience, human experiences.
Absolutely.
It's going to be really important then to be diagnosing these conditions if we have therapies for them. So when is it best to instigate therapy? I mean, is therapy just as effective at the earlier stages as it is the later stages? When should a person be considering genetic testing?
One of the really exciting things in the IRD space is that there are all these different emerging technologies being developed kind of at the same time. So, and again, you guys will break this down in very high detail in some of the following episodes. There are things like gene therapy where we try and correct that particular gene mutation. That's more effective in earlier stages of the disease because what we want is most of the photoreceptor cells to still be relatively healthy. And the number that we think need to be present is around about 2/3 of the photoreceptors should be still functioning to really have the best effect for gene therapy. But other treatments, things like stem cells, for example, that could be an option for people that are later down the track. And then bionic eyes or vision prostheses where you use electrodes to replace the function of the photoreceptors. You don't need your photoreceptors anymore. So that can be quite end stage. And so that's bringing a lot of hope to people that have got these conditions because we are looking at different therapeutic avenues for people at different stages of disease.
Genetic testing raises ethical considerations that need really careful examination.
Absolutely. So I think there's a lot of concern by a lot of people about, what does this mean? And so a really large part of genetic testing is having really thorough discussions with people about what is involved. People need to be assured and confident that their data will be safe. So, if you're giving your genetic information, you want to make sure it's looked after well. And so obviously research groups like myself and clinical providers, have incredibly stringent guidelines in place and ways of making sure that happens. The other aspect, I guess, of the ethics of genetic testing is what else could it show? So we go into genetic testing looking for the cause of a vision problem, and that's what we're targeting. But sometimes there are unexpected things that come up. So sometimes we might identify that a person that thought they just had an eye disease actually has a syndrome. And so maybe they might be at risk of losing their hearing, for example, or something else in their body might change. And so sometimes people don't want to know that. So it's really important that they're aware that that's a possibility. The other big one is family relationships. So when we do genetic testing, we are able to look at a family tree and work out who in the family has had a particular condition and then match that up with the genetic testing results we've got. And sometimes they don't match up. And that might be because somebody in someone's family has been adopted and they're not aware of that. And those sort of challenges, again, can really make this complex. So we always, very much make sure that people are aware of all of the possibilities that could come from genetic testing.
In Australia, we're really, really lucky to have universal health care. So that just means that everybody in Australia who is a resident of Australia, who is an Australian citizen, has access to the health system. Where does genetic testing fit into this? Will everyone have equitable access to genetic testing and treatment?
Yeah, unfortunately not. And this is something that, again, clinicians, researchers, policymakers in this space are trying to change. It is incredibly expensive to do genetic testing and counselling and all of the appointments that are involved. So at the moment, the public system will definitely prioritise people that need genetic testing. And these are people that might be suitable for treatments that are either available now or coming soon, people that might be family planning and want to know, what their chances are of passing that down. That's another important time to do testing. But it's definitely not for everyone at this point, and that's very much due to costs and resources that are needed. I'm hopeful that, we can continue to improve the efficiency, the accessibility of these sort of tests so that more people can access it. And that's something where, obviously it's going to include government, clinicians, researchers, patients, the whole lot to make that happen.
So what would I be up for then when I walk through that door? Access genetic counselling, access testing, and then further genetic counselling potentially? Yeah,
and it's a really hard question to answer, and it's a big sticking point for us when we are referring people to get further assessments, because we don't really know at the start, because you don't quite know which test they're going to need and how much counselling and how many appointments and things. But, we could be talking thousands of dollars, which can be a really significant impact for families, especially if there's multiple people in the family that want to go down that path. Becomes very expensive very quickly.
And once someone has been through all those processes, there is the possibility that they may be able to access treatment.
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, at the moment there is only one treatment at the moment, this drug called Luxturna. There will be more coming up.
And that's only if I have that particular condition.
Exactly. So it's one particular gene. You have to have that gene mutation on both copies of the gene in your body. It's a very small group of people that are suitable, but, an incredible treatment opportunity for them. An interesting space is that these treatments are very specific. They're very resource intensive to develop, and unfortunately that means they're very expensive as well. So we're very lucky in Australia that there is government support to help cover the costs of these treatments. But if you were looking at, paying for the actual cost of a gene therapy out of pocket, it will be over $1 million for treatments.
Wow.
Yeah. So, it's not sustainable for people to do that. So we are incredibly lucky, obviously, to have support from different places to allow patients to have access to that.
What does Luxturna treatment look like?
So it's an injection. So it's a subretinal injection. It's a once-off, which is where it becomes really mind-blowing for me. So we mentioned in our introductory episode that retinal cells aren't replaced as we get older. And the beautiful thing with that is it means that if we correct the gene mutation in the cells in the retina, then we theoretically don't have to do it again. We've done it once, it should be fixed. And so what happens is that the correct version of the gene is injected in a little virus, a little carrier, in underneath the retina.
A good virus.
A good virus, exactly.
Yeah.
A virus with all the bad bits stripped out. And then, it basically infects the retina. It lets that new version of the gene into all of the cells and then helps to correct the function. And so
of the existing cells. So they need to be existing viable cells.
That's right. That's right. And that's why we really want to target people at a young age with these sorts of treatments. The most successful cases that we've seen have been people that are either kids or teenagers. Adults are still doing very well as well, but there have been some outstanding results. So some of the people that are getting this treatment are going from not being able to see at all at nighttime to being able to play soccer with their friends or play in the bedroom at nighttime without the lights on. It's quite mind-blowing advances, really.
Now, does this gene therapy change a person's vision? Are we restoring vision or just preserving cells and so preventing progression of cell death and then that resultant vision impairment?
That's exactly right. So that is the primary aim of gene therapy, is we're just trying to slow down, or hopefully halt the progression of the disease. But I mentioned then that some people have had improvement, and that's because this RP65 gene that I'm talking about has a very specific role where when you replace that function, it can lead to an improvement. But that's not always going to be the case for the treatments coming out. So I guess the take-home message is all of these IRD emerging treatments in general, we just want to stop it from getting worse. We really want to stop that disease in its tracks.
That's with gene therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Stem cell therapy and bionic eye isn't necessarily about prevention though.
That's right. So they're more targeted at later stages. There's a whole range, and again, you can talk about this in more detail later, but there's lots of different techniques for using, for example, stem cells to help someone that has an IRD. But the general concept is if you've lost the photoreceptors, so you've got an IRD, you've lost that photoreceptor cells, is there a way that we can replace them by growing new ones? And so one of the breakthrough inventions that has led to this possibility is called induced pluripotent stem cells. And it's this concept that we can take a sample from a person that has an IRD, so it might be a skin sample or a hair sample. In the lab, you can turn that back into a stem cell, and then you can turn that into an eye cell. So
it's amazing.
It's amazing. So you can become quite often an RPE, retinal pigment epithelial cell, and then those cells can be used to test new drugs or new treatments in the lab, or potentially they could be then implanted into patients.
Replace the deficit.
Yeah, so quite mind-blowing opportunities, challenges as well, no doubt. And then similarly with the bionic eye, the idea there is that if you don't have those light-sensitive cells anymore, if the photoreceptors have been lost, can we implant electrodes either into the retina itself or back at the optic nerve or even in the brain to sort of replace that visual stimulus? So we're kind of getting rid of the need to change light into electricity by just generating the electricity immediately.
Directly. I know you've worked across the bionic eye field and then moved into the gene therapy field. Do you think they're competing fields of research? Because potentially gene therapy could be the answer, couldn't it?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I always joke that I kind of hope that some of our research studies will put the others out of business. That's what we're aiming for, right? I'm really interested in the way that some of these technologies could work together. And I think that the more that we're learning about how the retina works, we're starting to learn things like sometimes applying electricity to the eye might help with uptake of drugs and might help to help the retina to preserve its health over a longer time. So there's a lot of research going into the overlap between all these different techniques as well, which is very exciting.
And so when we're looking at these therapies, are we targeting specific cells? Are we targeting the retinal pigment epithelium? Are we targeting the photoreceptors, the ganglion cells? What are we looking at?
Yeah, so when it comes to gene therapy, that's definitely what we try and do. I mentioned before that we use, virus carriers, so just sort of the external components of a virus to get the treatment into the eye. And you can actually choose different types of viruses to try and prioritize the cells that you get to. So there's some types of viruses which prefer to go to the back of the retina, some prefer to go to the front of the retina. Obviously, we can inject into different parts of the eye to prioritize that as well. But I think, at the moment it would be fair to say that, it is likely that we're probably getting a broader spread of treatment, but very much the treatments are being developed to target the primary cause of that damage.
Only after I had my daughter did it sort of become really difficult to process, because my father at this stage had become legally blind. And because I don't see my father, because he lives in Malaysia and I live here, and he came to visit when my daughter was born, it hit me really strongly at that stage that I might also become legally blind, and that, in fact, was very highly probable. And I think it sort of precipitated a crisis in me where I really spiraled and have been spiraling for the last year or so. I'm trying to deal with this and the fact that I'm sort of at a certain stage in my career where I really have to start thinking long term. So having to reevaluate all those things at this point has been really challenging.
I know that you talk about grieving and you go through these stages, but for me, I'm still pretty upset about it. I'm still pretty angry about it, which is a crazy thing to be angry at an illness, but it changes the whole rest of your life. It changes every plan you've ever had for yourself. It changes your entire future going forward. So I accept it. I know that it's happening, but I'm not at peace with it. I simply accept it, which is, when you say acceptance, it sounds like you're at peace with it. I'm not at peace with it. What it affected was my internal life. So my first reaction to it was, don't tell anybody. When the doctor was telling me that I did indeed have RP, my husband was home. I grabbed my husband. I said, please sit here, because I think you're going to need to listen to what she has to say. Both of us need to listen, because I could tell I was not emotionally in a great place to be hearing what she was saying. And for quite some time, he was the only one who knew. I didn't even tell my mother. Nothing. I told my brother, because he would understand the emotional process I was going through.
Lauren, one of the really wonderful areas that your research group is currently focused on, it's trying to understand the impact of an inherited retinal disease diagnosis, because that can be quite confronting to hear when you're young, because your priorities are really on your immediate future rather than your long-term future. And you still do have fully functional vision maybe at that point in time, but you're told that in 20 years you might not.
Yeah, so we're very interested in, I guess, this journey. So, there's a lot of resources available for people that have, severe vision loss, and things like guide dogs and long canes and those sorts of aids are fantastic. But one of the things that we've been quite interested in as a research team is, what does the journey look like? What's it like when you're originally diagnosed, and how can you be helped at those stages as well? So we've got, a number of projects going on looking at those sort of questions, and also interviewing parents and family members, and especially if it's a child that's diagnosed with an IRD, how is that for them, and what support needs do they need, and how can they be better helped along that journey as well?
It must be so confronting to be told that you would lose your vision within the next 10 years or within the next 20 years or within your working life.
Yeah.
Because we sort of go through schooling, most of us with vision, with sight, and take it for granted, don't we?
Absolutely. And I think another one of the big challenges too, and we hear this a lot from people that we work with is, they may have been diagnosed 15, 20 years ago and they're told nothing can be done yet, but in 5 years, it's always with us, with scientists, it's always 5 years, right? In 5 years, there'll be a treatment. And I think people, it's tiring, because you're kind of always waiting for this miracle and this next thing to come. And people often say to us, look, I've heard this for a long time. So, with caveats that, we don't know yet what the future will hold, it is a really exciting time just because there is so much in the pipeline. There are these gene therapies, these stem cells, these devices, there's drugs that are all trying to correct these different things. And so we're really hopeful that that will help people with that kind of initial discussion and that diagnosis. But you're right, it's a hard thing to hear. And I think one of the things I'd love our listeners to be aware of is it's not a death sentence. There's so many people that are living amazing, fulfilled, independent lives, traveling overseas, becoming artists. It just makes things a little trickier.
It does.
And so we really, the point of our research team is we want to find ways to make that journey as easy as possible. And obviously the holy grail is a cure that just stops it. But if there's other things we can do, if there's aids, if there's different ways of supporting people, that's just as important. And for people to be aware that there's many other techniques that can help them with their day-to-day life.
It is a trauma. It is an end of the world you had, but I think people go in one of two ways with it. Either it becomes a catastrophe and they feel sorry for you, which I can't stand the thought of that. Or there's this blind person trope, the blind, brave person who has extra special hearing and smelling skills and can do all sorts of brave and wonderful things. That is equally infuriating. It definitely sucks. But I also have not gotten any superhero powers. It's adjustments every single day. Like, I carry a super high beam flashlight with me all the time. It works better than a cane. It lights up everything in front of me. That's not something I had to do before. My old computer, the graphics were not as crisp as the new graphics are, and my keyboard was too dark for me to use. So I just got a new computer with a backlit keyboard and very sharp graphics. It's made a big difference. And the light bulbs, all the light bulbs in my apartment are special light bulbs with very, very high output lumens, like a surgery in here. But it works for me. Other people aren't that comfortable in here, I've seen, but it works for me. So you just keep adding more light, streamlining your furniture. So you always know how to find things. Oh gosh, you lose something, you never get it back again. That is one of the worst things. If I put my phone down and walk away from it and just sort of forget where I've put it, I might spend the rest of the day looking for it. It is maddening. So you have to have fewer things. And I think maybe if there's a silver lining, RP is a slide into blindness, not sudden blindness. So you have the opportunity to adjust as you go.
So what sort of challenges do people face when they do get that diagnosis?
We've done a lot of research looking into exactly those day-to-day challenges of once you have low vision, but also that sort of transition and getting used to the idea of diagnosis. And we do, definitely get some really rich information from people about that stage. And that's now we're working with a lot of the patient support groups to try and turn that into, useful guidelines and documents and things that can help people in that process. We've been really interested as well in how people feel about these emerging treatments. We sort of talk about how exciting it is because there's all of these new things coming up. But what we realised a few years ago is that no one was really asking people with IRDs about their thoughts on it. So we've now done an Australian survey and also an international survey of people that have IRDs or parents of a child that has a condition, asking them about what they think about these treatments, what the barriers might be, their fears, their hopes for the future. And so we've got this amazing data now of over 1,200 people from around the world where we're actually able to answer some of those questions for the community, but also for us as researchers. So one of the really exciting things for us was that over 90% of people say that they really want gene therapy. They want these treatments to come through the pipeline. And so that, I guess, is very reassuring for us.
Yes.
That we're exactly
been doing all this work.
Not wasting our time. So that's really great to have. And then also I think it's that beautiful thing of people realizing that we want to be working on things that are relevant to them, and that we understand that there'll be people that don't want these treatments and are incredibly happy with their vision as it is, and it's not stopping them from doing anything, and that's just as important to remember.
Religious or moral decisions a huge part of how people feel towards gene therapy and those sorts of treatments?
I think they were more historically, because originally with stem cell therapy, the best way to do stem cell research was using embryonic stem cells. So they were taken from discarded embryos, often from IVF practices and things. And that obviously raises concerns, if especially if you're religious, as to the sanctity of life and things like that. And so I think now that we have these technologies where we can, make stem cells from other cells from the body, that really helps get through some of those other aspects as well. But it's an excellent point. I've definitely spoken to people who, who do say, look, this is how I was made, and this is fine, and that and again, that's absolutely fine. It's just if we can give them some additional resources, if we can help them develop a long cane that's more effective, let's do that.
That's so nice to see that there has been a real shift in person-centred care as well, that it's not only, migrating through research, but from research it will permeate through to, the whole field of medicine, because historically we did research for our own benefit.
Yeah, that's it. And this is the thing, right?
Because we were curious.
Exactly. And that's the thing. And I love actually that research has changed like that. We now, if we're applying for grants, we have to prove how this is relevant.
Demonstrate why people want it.
Absolutely. And it should be. And so we have people with IRDs involved in all our research projects. They're helping us develop the projects. They're helping us, write papers and things like that. And that's very important to us.
Yeah.
The other thing I think which is very exciting, in a lot of research, but particularly in IRDs, is the fact that we're acknowledging that these are very rare conditions. And so if we want to learn more about a condition that we might have 4 people in Australia that have, we've got to collaborate. So we're also now working very much on collaborating internationally. And with that goes those same considerations. How do we make sure that people are completely anonymous and that there's no risk of anyone's data being compromised? And that's all obviously very, very high in mind. But it's incredibly exciting to think about, working as a world, not just one lab, but actually working globally to try and answer these questions and find better treatments for people is a pretty exciting advance that we're very much moving towards now.
Yeah, absolutely. Globalisation of research.
It's a good thing.
Isn't it? Lauren, your research really is at the forefront of where we currently sit for inherited retinal diseases. So what are potential future advancements in this field? We've talked about gene therapy, we've talked about stem cells and bionic eye, and these are all such futuristic concepts, aren't they? They're super science fiction. To think of bionic eye really is a huge advancement. To think that we could create something that could replicate something as complex to the function of what the retina is able to do is incredible.
Yeah.
Granted, we can't replicate the retina.
Yep.
But we're trying.
We're getting there. Slow process.
Yeah, absolutely. So is this it? Is this it? Or, or is there more?
I think there's more. I'm really excited. And again, I know you will talk about this more another time, but things, for example, like gene therapy, at the moment, a lot of the trials are very much focused on one particular gene, identifying the problem, fixing that specific problem for that specific person, very, very small patient numbers really. And so things like gene editing, where it's a more generic treatment, there's other drugs that are coming onto the market, or coming into research, I should say, which are more generic. And that's really exciting for me, being able to treat greater numbers of people at a time, I think will really open up the doors. So I think it's going to be a really, really interesting decade, to be honest. So we definitely, in our field, we expect that there'll be more, commercially available treatments in that sort of 5-10 year bracket. It will become more and more important, as we've discussed, to, correctly diagnose people, make sure we know what their clinical characterization is, as well as what the genes are too. And I think, moving forward as well, it will be sort of that interaction between people that have these conditions and the researchers and the pharmaceutical companies so that we can really target what the best treatments are moving forward. I think it's going to just be a moving feast as we continue forward.
So how do people stay informed? How do people keep up to date? Particularly people who have these conditions may have seen their local practitioner, health practitioner, optometrist, and haven't really gotten the advice that they've wanted to hear. Perhaps their practice, because it's such an emerging field of science. It's new. It's incredibly innovative, but it's completely new information for everybody.
Absolutely.
So how do people keep up to date with all this emerging information?
So we have some really amazing patient support and advocacy groups in Australia, and again, we can pop those into the show notes. But groups like Retina Australia and Vision Australia, Blind Citizens Association, Usher Kids Australia, just to name a few. These sorts of groups are fantastic because they work very closely with research groups like ours to try and make sure they're getting up-to-date information and sort of translating it and getting it out to the community. And that's something that my group and many other research groups are very passionate about. We don't want our work sitting in a lab. That doesn't benefit anyone. We want it out there. So, having that sort of open communication channel is really important. And I think, the other thing is, obviously for either people with the conditions or for clinicians is, there are ways to reach out to the research groups. So again, we can give a list of the different ones in different states, but, we're very happy to have discussions with people to register them on our databases for future trials, for example.
Because there are clinical trials that are ongoing that people can register themselves on.
That's right. That's right. And one of the interesting lessons for us, when the drug that is approved, Luxturna, was approved, and made its way to Australian shores, it was a bit of a scramble. People were, we were trying to go through medical records and find people and work out who was eligible. So we now have these fantastic databases across the country. And if people have a condition like this, they can register with us so that as these treatments come up, we can say, okay, great, this is how many people we have and we know this person's interested and make it a lot more streamlined.
Yeah, and so that people can access it straight away.
Exactly.
Awesome. I want to end this episode not only thanking Associate Professor Lauren Ayton for her time and work in this space, but also for my other guests who have so generously shared their stories of living with an inherited retinal disease. As you heard, it is so important for us to listen to and understand their perspectives, as it will only make us better clinicians and people for it. Thanks for listening to Talking Eyes. Additional resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. If you found the content of our podcast interesting, feel free to post a great review and share it with your community. If you have a topic you'd like to hear more about, or have expertise in the field of vision and would like to contribute to future series, contact me via our socials on Facebook and Instagram. I'm Leanne Trin, your host of Talking Eyes.